Anthony Albanese made a promise after leading his party to victory.
And on behalf of the Australian Labor Party, I commit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full.
That statement from 2017 called for a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution and for a Makarrata Commission which would supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. The official question for a referendum to change the Constitution was put to the public.
It will read, a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration?
A month later, the federal opposition formally announced its position.
Well, the Liberal Party resolved today to say yes to constitutional recognition for Indigenous Australians, but there was a resounding no to the Prime Minister's Canberra voice.
6 months of intense campaigning followed.
This is a momentous opportunity for all of us, black and white, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We can do this.
If you don't know, vote no!
We must vote no for unifying this nation to maintain equality in our country.
As the results came in, the outcome quickly became clear.
With 3 states voting no, the referendum is defeated as well.
Anthony Green has called it at 7:24 p.m. The Indigenous Voice referendum has been defeated.
A year on and questions remain on what the next steps for recognition and reconciliation will be.
We accept the outcome of the referendum. The voice was never the end in itself. The voice was the means to close the gap by listening to people.
We invited both the Minister for Indigenous Australians and the Shadow Minister onto the program to discuss the anniversary. Both were unavailable. Professor Tom Calma is one of Australia's most respected campaigners for Indigenous rights and was one of the architects of The Voice. He joined me earlier. Professor Tom Calma, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you, David.
So 12 months on, what have been the consequences of Australians voting no to The Voice?
Well, I think there's been quite a number of them. In the ACT we celebrated because we voted yes. 66% of the ACT voted yes. In other states it's been very varied. For Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, there's been very mixed reactions. What we've found, and we've reported on this, is that there's been a higher level of racism and racial slurs, both on social media and quite openly. And it's like as if people think that they've now got a licence to have a go. And
that's changed since the referendum.
Yes, it has increased. And, it's always been around, but it seems to be much more, prevalent now, particularly on social media. And that's a concern at one level. That's at a community level, individuals. I think more worrying for me is, I'm worried about that, but is the way the opposition is saying that they now have a mandate to review and play with Indigenous programs.
They want an audit of
They want to audit all the
programs
bodies. And they're talking about all programs actually, and all statutory organisations. And so that's a real concern because the whole purpose of the Voice was to try and get some stability that was apolitical, that could cross irrespective of who was in Parliament at the day, whereas now we'll see a change.
So given that and the elevated levels of racism that you talk about, was it worth it? Or do you think when it was becoming increasingly clear Australians were going to vote no, this should have been withdrawn?
I think there was a lot of mixed messages out there as to whether Australians would vote yes or no. On the ground, we were still having very positive feedback from those who were door knocking. And I want to acknowledge the 60,000 people who volunteered to work with us across the communities. Many of those have not been involved in Indigenous affairs before, but they got involved now, and the 6.2 million people who voted yes. But the key thing was that from the Reconciliation Australian point of view, we were getting very positive feedback. From the community, we were getting positive feedback.
So you thought you were still going to win?
Yeah, and I must point out that Minister Dutton, not Minister Dutton, but Peter Dutton, opposition leader, had on 3 occasions met with the expert panel who were advising, and that was encouraging because he kept on coming back. Unfortunately, what he heard in the meetings and what he then did at a presser straight after the meetings were 2 different things. So,
but we knew he was opposed to it after all of that. He was very vocal in opposing it during the campaign, as was his shadow minister. But just coming back to this question, you still think it was worth proceeding without that bipartisanship, and even when the polls were indicating it was going to go down?
Well, I think by that time it was, a bit too late to reverse it, and I think there were a couple of turning points. One was when one of the opposition spokespersons, indicated that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people didn't want this, and yet we found after the referendum that about 90% of Aboriginal people supported it. So where they were coming from as an Indigenous person was very misleading. And the worst feedback, and I called this out on the night of the election, was when Peter Dutton said that, and he'd made it very public, that if the referendum was lost, he would hold another referendum just to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. Now, people in the lead up to that were saying, look, we don't have to vote yes because we know we're going to get another referendum. And of course, he recanted on that straight after.
But just to be clear, you weren't aware of conversations in the Yes campaign or with the government about potentially calling it off?
Not to my recollection, there were none.
Okay. Look, one of the most powerful arguments from Peter Dutton and other no campaigners was this idea that the Voice, putting it in the Constitution, would entrench separatism, that it would create a set of rights for one group of Australians over others in the Constitution. 12 months on, do you think that was a persuasive argument?
I'd be interested. He never really articulated what those special rights were. As far as we were aware, and we firmly believe that those rights are our basic human rights, and that were articulated through the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Human Rights Act.
But do you think it was persuasive? Why do you think there was such an overwhelming no vote?
That's a quandary, and I think one of the big issues that I saw was that people were conflating state legislation and what was happening in the WA Heritage Act debacle that was going on, and thinking that could translate into the national level. 2 different acts, and they were applied very differently. So it's that misinformation, disinformation that clouded it, and people, I think, people, there's a lot of genuine people, and we saw this after the referendum when ANU did the review of no voters, to find out that many would have supported a voice or they would have supported recognition, but they didn't support both.
So where to now, Tom Calma? Should recognition in the Constitution, however that looks, still be a priority?
I believe it should be, and it's we're the only liberal democracy that doesn't recognise the First Peoples in their constitution, and that's a concern. But I think there's also the issue of what's happening at a local level, because the referendum and the Voice was about the national level, the federal level, and the states and territories are still doing setting up different structures.
Well, indeed, Queensland and Victoria have truth-telling processes that are underway, and they have been hearing some, harrowing stories of moments in our history. Are they working as intended? Are they really engaging Australians, do you think, in our history?
I think they were, and we just have to go back to the 2008 National Apology. And, that was really, for me, a turning point, because the population didn't really understand about some of the atrocities that were inflicted on Aboriginal people.
But do we need something like that, do you think, at the federal level? Because the Uluru Statement, along with calling for a voice, called for a Makarrata Commission, and the Albanese government is not interested in setting up a federal Makarrata Commission by the sounds of it.
Yes, well, they've put that on hold, and diverted the money into other activities. Look, I believe it needs to happen at a national level. We saw it from the apology. We saw it, and people just need to reflect on what happened when they heard about the forgotten Australians. and those people who were similarly incarcerated as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were. And, you know, that opened a lot of hearts and understanding. Then we had the apology to the people whose babies were forcibly removed, unwed mothers. So
you think we need that at the federal level? Do you feel as though the Albanese government has abandoned the field at the moment when it comes to leading the way forward for Indigenous Australians?
Yeah, they've reprioritised it from what I can understand and from what I hear.
And that disappoints you?
It does, but you know, in saying that, Reconciliation Australia is still working, as we have been for the last 25 years, on looking at you know, truth telling and informing the community, and that's a process that goes on. But at a national level, yeah, you look at South Africa, Canada, all of these countries have had their own, Barbados, truth telling, and that's only been better for the community.
What about the idea of a voice? You know, Australians said no to putting it in the Constitution. Do you think they also said no to legislating?
Not at all. And this is a real interesting one, because the coalition and the work that Professor Marcia Langton and I did on the co-design was under the coalition government, leading up into when there was a change of government. They were very keen on a legislative approach. There were some Aboriginal people that didn't at the time, were keen on constitutional. You know, I think this is a point of discussion that we need to take up again.
So is that your appeal to both sides of politics, to legislate a national voice?
We need to create a structure for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, beyond the coalition of peaks, but for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the nation, to be able to have a mechanism to be able to work with government, not tell them how to do things, but in the interest. Like, you know, every year we you know, flagellate over why we haven't achieved the closing the gap targets, but you know, some of the ways the government approach it aren't necessarily good.
Well, just finally on that, I mean, the closing the gap targets again show little progress. In fact, we're going backwards on some of the measures, given there's no bipartisanship or sign of bipartisanship on the way forward on Indigenous policy. Can I ask you, Tom Calma, what gives you hope as someone who's dedicated their life to this issue of social justice for Indigenous Australians? What right now is giving you hope?
Well, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the resilience that we have to address the issues. We very much see health holistically. So we're looking at social, emotional wellbeing, physical health, mental health and so forth, and communities there. The resurgence in the recording and revitalising and reteaching of languages, Indigenous languages, is so important, and you know, I'm working in that space at the moment. But one of the biggest problems that we experience in Indigenous affairs is a change of government and a change of policy direction. So you go one step forward and then you're 3 steps back when we get a change. You look at housing, Indigenous housing policies. Why we got such a dire need for housing? Because it changes all the time between the feds fighting with the states. And you know, we've just got to get bipartisanship, and we've got to get a much better working relationship across the nation.
Professor Tom Calma, thank you.
Thanks, David.